Hello, everybody. It is I, Mr. N. Huzzah! And we are returning once again for some more stories. Specifically, Dragonology Chronicles, The Dragon's Eye. And so, um, you may remember where we left off last time was Dr. Drake had been consumed in dragon fire. Oh no! Ah! And Ignatius took Daniel and Beatrice to the lair of Scramasax, Scorcher's mom, and returned Scorcher and was like, "Oh, you should give me the dragon's eye because look, I brought your baby back, and here's two children that stole of the guy that stole this treasure from you." And he tried to convince Scramasax that Beatrice and Daniel's dad was the one who had stolen the horn from her. But unbeknownst to him, Dr. Drake and his flame-proof cloak had actually survived the dragon fire, and he had beaten them there and had told Scramasax everything. And so Ignatius and his goons, after a hard-fought battle, were defeated, and the charm holding Idrager under Ignatius's control was broken, and so the dragons are all now free once again, and Scramasax gave Dr. Drake a riddle that will lead to the true location of the dragon's eye. So that is where we are picking up today. Chapter 22. Wantley. Idrager lowered his long neck to the ground. Dr. Drake took the blanket that had covered Scorcher's cage, folded it several times, and placed it over the dragon's shoulders, so that we would be protected as much as possible from the spines on Idrager's back. He then helped us to climb up. I sat in front of Beatrice, who gripped me tightly around the waist. Then Dr. Drake climbed onto the dragon too, sitting in front of us so that he could direct Idrager. Then Scorcher came padding out of the cave mouth to see us off. He made a few screeching noises, and we waved at him. "Goodbye, Scorcher!" shouted Dr. Drake. "By the time I see you again, perhaps you will have begun to speak a little. Take care of your mother." Idrager stood up slowly, spread out his huge wings, took 2 or 3 steps forward, and launched himself off the mountainside and into the sky. He beat his powerful wings to gain height, then turned in a great slow arc towards the south. I could feel my heart pounding. Far below us I could see the forests on the slope of Ben Wyvis, and farther off Loch Ness shimmering in the great glen. But soon we were past it, winging our way across the Grampian Mountains and crossing the Firth of Forth. A few hours later, after flying over a great deal of countryside and several towns, Dr. Drake shouted, "See that city below us? That is London! We're nearly home!" We did not fly directly over London, for there was too much smoke rising up from the thousands and thousands of chimneys, even though it was July. Instead, we flew around it in a large arc until we were above Sussex, where we began our descent. Idrager began swooping around in a series of circles, getting lower and lower each time, until he must have been only a few hundred feet above the ground. "Now," cried Dr. Drake, "there is Horsham. I can see the church spire. Bear to the left, and fly out past the farmland and over to the forest." Idrager obeyed, and it was not long before we saw Castle Drake nestled among the trees. "Set us down there!" cried Dr. Drake. The dragon made 1 or 2 more slow loops and put his feet down on Dr. Drake's front lawn. We climbed down off Idrager's back and saw Darcy, Emery, and Mademoiselle Gamay running out of the house to welcome us. Dr. Drake turned to Idrager. "Now," said the dragon, "I shall return home. I do not like to leave it for long, but if you wish me to, I will return. I would not like to see the dragon's eye in the hand of that man Ignatius." "Then return to us in 3 days' time," said Dr. Drake. "I do not think this riddle will take me long to solve." Idrager bowed. Then, without further ado, he took 5 paces forward, lunged upwards, and flew into the sky. Next, Dr. Drake spoke to Beatrice, who, carrying the egg, went into the house with Mademoiselle Gamay. He then led Emery, Darcy, and myself to the old coal shed. "We need to erect some sort of chimney in here," he said. "We have a dragon's egg to hatch, and we're going to need ventilation." Emery nodded, and he and Darcy set off to find some tools. "Now, Daniel," said Dr. Drake, "I would like both you and Beatrice to work on this riddle. You will need to write it down in your dragonological record books. But I would also like you to spend some time writing notes on everything that you have learned on our adventure." I went back into the house to find Beatrice. To my horror, I found that Beatrice had built a little fire in the grate in the drawing-room, even though it was summertime, and had placed the egg among the flames. "What are you doing?" I cried, leaping forward in order to rescue the egg. "It's all right, Daniel," she replied. "Dr. Drake says that we must keep the egg as warm as possible, so as not to harm the developing chick inside. Emery and Darcy are going to build a proper charcoal nest for it in the coal shed, but until then we need to keep it here." Later that evening, Dr. Drake called us into his study. "Have either of you had any ideas on the solution to Scramasax's riddle?" he asked. Beatrice and I had spent the afternoon making copious notes in our diaries, with breaks to check on the egg. We had talked about the riddle, but it didn't seem as simple as the one on Ebenezer Crook's grave. "Is there a place called Wantley somewhere?" asked Beatrice. "That's the trouble," said Dr. Drake. "I have pored over my atlas, and I cannot find Wantley anywhere. I wish I had my dragon diary. You see, there is an amusing rhyme about a dragon from Wantley. It is based on a legend about a dragon that is defeated by a knight in spiked armor who hides at the bottom of a well. Oh, it's very frustrating. I can only hope that there is some reference to it in one of my books. I have also written a short note to Mr. Flight at my shop, and one to Lord Chiddingfold, explaining what has happened. It may be that they can find out some information up in London." But as much as Dr. Drake searched through all the books in his library, he could not crack the puzzle. Meanwhile, Darcy took us to see Weasel and to help look after Jamal, who seemed pleased to see us every time we turned up with a wheelbarrow full of meat for him. We even tried to play another game of football with him, but he merely crushed the ball beneath his feet. His attempts at flying were growing better by the day, and I knew that before long Dr. Drake would have to take him home. We also went to check up on the egg, which was now installed in its own little nest in the coal shed. Dr. Drake showed us how to use the bellows in order to bring the charcoal fire up to the right temperature. It was 2 days later that help with the riddle finally arrived. Beatrice and I were on our way to visit Jamal when a carriage pulled into the drive of Castle Drake, bearing Billy and Alicia. Dr. Drake came out to greet them immediately. "I have a message from my father," said Billy. He says that a researcher he knows at the Great British Library has confidently identified Wantley. Given what has happened, he wants you to go there as soon as possible. Mr. Tibbs doesn't exactly agree with him, but this time my father overruled him." "Where is it?" said Dr. Drake. "The real Wantley is a village called Warncliffe," said Alicia. "It's not far from Sheffield." "Warncliffe!" exclaimed Dr. Drake. "Of course! The knight that killed the dragon in the legend was called More of More Hall. Oh, I knew that More Hall lay not far on the other side of Sheffield, but I never thought of Warncliffe. I shall leave tomorrow. Daniel and Beatrice, while I am away, I would like you to bring Billy and Alicia up to date on everything that has happened." "Aren't we coming with you?" I asked. "Not this time," said Dr. Drake. "I am afraid it's too dangerous." "And what about the rest of the riddle?" "Well, I'm hoping that part of it can be solved when I arrive. I'm also guessing that the Wantley Dam is another name for the Guardian. As for the word that I must take her, I have an idea on what that might be. In any case, at least we are still one jump ahead of Ignatius Crook." I went inside with my record book and sat on the lawn. It didn't seem fair that Dr. Drake had taken us along on so much of this adventure, but was going to leave us out of the most important part. Danger or not, I would have loved to have come face to face with the most ancient dragon in the British Isles. What stories she would be able to tell about days gone by. I opened my record book to the page where I had written down the riddle. I took out my pencil and wrote, "Wantley equals Warncliffe." I circled it over and over. Suddenly my record book was yanked out of my hand. I looked up to see a very familiar blue creature flying off with it. "Flitz!" I shouted. I got up and ran after him. Flitz flew through the trees carrying my record book. Little sparks started to come out of his mouth, and I was worried that my book was going to catch fire. Somehow or other, I managed to keep him in my sights as he came to the road. Alexandra Gorinchka was waiting, sitting on a large black horse. "Do be careful, Flitz," she said with a laugh as Flitz landed on the pommel of her saddle and presented her with the now smoking book. I stepped forward. "That book is mine," I said. But Alexandra just held up her hand as she flicked through the pages. When she came to the page with the riddle, she tore it out and tossed the book back to me. "Here you are, Daniel," she said. "I am glad that you are such a thorough little dragonologist. Luckily for you, I am in quite a hurry. Flitz can be rather nasty when I want him to be." "I thought Flitz belonged to Ignatius," I cried. "So does Ignatius," said Alexandra, laughing. "What a fool!" I backed away. Alexandra laughed even harder. "By the way," she said, "I heard a rumor that Ignatius has sent those two ruffians of his here, and this time they won't be taking you prisoner." She cantered away, chuckling to herself, as Flitz flew round and round her head. I ran back to the house as fast as I could, dreading what Dr. Drake was going to say. I knocked on the door of his study. Chapter 23. The Dragon's Eye. The next day the Green Dragon returned to Castle Drake, not a moment too soon as far as Dr. Drake was concerned, and we set off on our second dragon flight. Given what I had told everyone about Alexandra and Flitz, Dr. Drake had decided to take us with him after all. "It is a question of the frying pan or the fire, I'm afraid," he had said, "and I would rather have you two with me." I felt that it had been my fault that Alexandra, and no doubt Ignatius too, had discovered the location of the Dragon's Eye. But Dr. Drake had told me that I could not possibly have expected Flitz to have stolen my record book so spectacularly. "And there is still a good chance that we will get there first," he said. We flew up over Sussex in fine weather. This time we were not riding bareback. Billy and Alicia had brought a fine dragon saddle with them from London, which Dr. Drake said had been crafted by a very discreet saddler indeed. Even so, the journey was not a particularly enjoyable one this time, mainly because Idrega was flying at full speed in an effort to reach Warncliffe as quickly as possible. Several hours later we could see the smoke rising over a city that must have been Sheffield. Below us lay a moor. "That must be Ramsley Moor," said Dr. Drake. "Land there. Warncliffe lies just to the east of it." Idrega began swooping in circles again and set us down near a small group of standing stones. We climbed off his back, and Dr. Drake loosened the harness on the saddle. Then he bowed low. "Idrega," he said, "I shall not forget what you have done for us." Idrega thumped his front feet on the ground. "Defeat that man, Ignatius," Idrega said. "That is all I ask." Then he took off again and flew upwards. Soon he had become no more than a tiny green speck in the sky. "Now," said Dr. Drake, "we must search for something that could be called the Smokestack. I imagine it will be some sort of pile of rocks." But although we searched the moor for several hours, we could find nothing that Dr. Drake thought might be the smokestack, and since we were growing tired and hungry, Dr. Drake said that we ought to stop and find somewhere to rest for the night. "But what about Ignatius?" I cried. "He and Alexandra might arrive here any minute." "That may be," said Dr. Drake, "but you children need food and rest now, and that is what you are going to have. And I have another reason for visiting Warncliffe. I think we are on a wild goose chase at the moment. I'm going to see if I can find out some information." And Dr. Drake led us off the moor to a small inn that lay on the outskirts of Warncliffe village. When I woke up the next day, I discovered that Dr. Drake had been up and about since the early morning, buying a spade, some provisions, and some candles, and trying to find out as much as he could about anything that might be called the smokestack out on the moor. He had been in luck. The lady who sold him the provisions had said that her mother often used to speak of it. It was a rocky hole in the ground from which, in olden days, smoke and flame had sometimes been seen. There was a story that very few people believed these days, that there was a dragon under Ramsley Moor, and it was she who caused the smoke and flames to rise up, almost as from a chimney. "It was right under our noses all along," said Dr. Drake. He led us back to the small circle of stones, and there, about 100 yards away, I found a depression in the ground that was filled with rocks. I could almost imagine that if you crawled down, you might find yourself in some sort of vertical shaft, and when I leaned over it, I could indeed see that there was a vent going downwards. "Well done, Daniel," said Dr. Drake. "Now that we have found the smokestack, we must find the entrance. It is hidden by a barren floor. Can you see a patch of ground that has nothing growing on it?" This time it was Beatrice who found what we were looking for. "There!" she said, pointing to a bare patch of ground a little farther on from the smokestack. "Are you sure?" I asked. "There seems to be quite a few bare patches of ground about." "Look!" she said. Suddenly it hit me. The other patches of ground were irregular, but this patch of ground was a perfect diamond shape. Dr. Drake smiled. "It's an obvious sign, really," he said. "I wonder that we missed it before." The soil was soft and came away very easily. I began to dig, but after about half an hour Dr. Drake took over, and soon we had excavated a sort of pit. Then Dr. Drake's spade hit solid stone. He grew more excited and excavated more and more quickly. The shape of some kind of ancient doorway began to emerge. When it was finally uncovered, he was about 4 feet high and about 6 feet below the surface of the rest of the ground. It was decorated with a fine carving of strange beasts, and at the top was a strange pyramid symbol with an eye. Around the bottom curled the body of a dragon. The door was made entirely of rock, except for the eyes of the creatures, which were made of gemstones. The creatures in the middle looked as though they were attacking each other. There was an ogre fighting a sort of serpent with a man's head, and an eagle and a phoenix battling it out above them. "Look," said Dr. Drake, pointing to the pyramid symbol at the top. "This is one of the very oldest and most secret symbols of the dragonological societies the world over. Few know that it represents the dragon's eye. But I wonder how we can open this door." He thought for a while. Beatrice, however, was feeling all over the door with her hands. "I think these gems might press—" "Stop!" cried Dr. Drake. Beatrice pulled her hand back from the gem in the eye of the phoenix at the last moment. Dr. Drake smiled. "I think I've got it," he said. "Thank you, Beatrice." "How?" said Beatrice. "Tell me the names of those 4 creatures in the middle." "Well," said Beatrice, "there's an ogre, something that looks like an eagle, a strange bird that looks like it has flames around it, and a sort of snake creature." "Is that a naga?" I said. "Indeed it is," said Dr. Drake. "And the other creature is a phoenix. Think of the first letters. What is it we want to do with the door?" Naga, ogre, phoenix, eagle," I said. This time it was Beatrice's turn to smile. "No, Daniel, it's ogre, phoenix, eagle, naga." "O-P-E-N, open!" I said. Dr. Drake began pressing the eyes of the 4 creatures. Each time he did so, there was a click, until at last the door swung silently open and a rush of hot air came out. It was hot air that carried a scent I recognized, the unmistakable smell of dragons. Handing us a candle each, which he lit with some matches, we went in through the doorway. Dr. Drake paused to wedge it shut behind us with his spade. "Do you think the door was booby-trapped?" asked Beatrice. She was obviously wondering what would have happened had she pressed the gems in the wrong order. "I am sure of it," said Dr. Drake. We found ourselves in a low, narrow chamber that soon opened out into a tunnel about 6 feet high, with walls carved all over with twisting serpentine shapes. We did not have time to study the carvings. Dr. Drake led us down the tunnel as it took a steep angle that led farther and farther underground. On and on we went, farther and farther down into the earth, until at last we stepped out in what seemed to be a vast cavern. The walls were covered in the same dragon-shaped carvings that had lined the tunnel. I was awestruck. I stepped forwards, but Dr. Drake grabbed my shoulder. "Be careful," he whispered. Looking down, I could see why. There was a chasm at my feet that seemed to run all the way around the walls of the enormous chamber. In the very center of the chamber was a platform, lit by a dim shaft of light coming from an entrance high above it. That must be the smokestack, I thought. The light bounced off a huge hoard of golden treasures, vastly bigger than the one possessed by Scramasax. There were cups and weapons and necklaces and gems and many other wonderful things rising in a great pyramid in the middle. And right on the top was a most magnificent gem, reflecting the light round the cavern in what seemed to be 1,000 colors. "These treasures were gathered together during the time of the last great dragon slaying in these lands," said Dr. Drake. "They were brought here by both dragonologists and dragons. They represent the remains of many hordes. They were brought here until such time as comes once again when it will be safe for dragons and humans to live in peace. But I fear that day shall be a very long time in coming." He pointed at the topmost gem. "That is the most precious treasure of them all. It is the dragon's eye. In recent times only Ebenezer Crook has ever set eyes upon it. The Society of Dragons gives each human dragon master the gem to keep until the time comes when the dragons must choose a new dragon master." Even though Dr. Drake had been whispering at the word "Dragon Master," a sudden hiss filled the hall, and I saw that coiled around the hoard, so big and white that it almost looked like stone, was a dragon that dwarfed even the mighty Idrega. From her massive but relatively small horns, I could tell that this was a female dragon. She raised her gigantic head slowly and turned her flashing eyes to look in our direction. She was the Guardian, the one whom the riddle spoke of as the Wantley Dam.
"What human speaks of the dragon's eye?"
asked the Dam, her gaze moving from one to another of us as she flicked out her tongue. "It is I," cried Dr. Drake. "With your blessing, and that of the Society of Dragons, I am come to claim the dragon's eye. I am sworn to conserve and protect all dragons, wheresoever they may be, so that at the last the world may learn to respect, the honorable science of dragonology."
"I am old," said the Wantley Dam, "much older than the normal course of a dragon's life, for I am 850 years from the egg. I have protected this gem from the sight of all human beings, save true dragon masters, for many hundreds of years, only relinquishing it to ones whom I and my companions thought worthy. Yet the last dragon master returned this gem to me, saying that none were fit to be his successor. I regret sometimes being so old. I could tell you of times when humans and dragons were not always at war. I could tell you of times when I was young and this whole land was covered with forests from one end to the other. But now I am old. I was old when I began my guardianship, when I called the first meeting of the Society of Dragons and bestowed the dragon's eye upon the first dragon master. It is nearly time for me to pass on my duty as guardian to another. I regret that my flame, which was once so strong, is very nearly exhausted. Otherwise I would have tested you with fire and claw. Such would not trouble a true dragon master. He would know how to deal with both. Yet I would still hear the secret word that all dragon masters must know, and I would know who these children you have brought with you are."
"I am Ernest Drake," said Dr. Drake. "These children are Daniel and Beatrice Cook. They are the children of two very good friends of mine. I have brought them here because their lives are in danger from one who is no friend to dragons. And I know the words you seek."
"I have heard the name Ernest Drake," said the dam. "I have often wondered why you did not come to claim the dragon's eye before. I have great empathy for Ebenezer Crook. It is not easy passing on to another a responsibility that one has borne for so long. If you would claim the gem now, speak the secret word. But be warned. If the word you speak is not true, then do not doubt that you shall not leave alive. Tell it to me."
And that is where we're going to leave off for today, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please tune in tomorrow for the conclusion of Dragonology Chronicles, The Dragon's Eye. That's right. We will reach the end tomorrow. Of course, be sure to check out our other live programs, Toddler Time with Miss Becky, Stories with Sunny, and Creating with Constance. Don't forget, this is the last week to get your minutes in for the summer reading program. So if you're doing the program this summer, be sure to get your minutes turned in by Saturday. And of course, the libraries are open, but you can still get curbside service if you prefer, and you still have access to digital content through sweetwaterlibraries.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bum, bum.